Living under the spell of the Palisades, the way they were formed, their history, those majestic cliffs, and how they were saved and protected. When one mentions the Palisades, many people think only of the cliffs. But through the years, a lot of history and activities have gone on there. The cliffs run 20 miles along the Hudson River from Jersey City to the heights at the State Line Lookout. The first people there were the Lenni Lenape Indians. They called the cliffs Weehawken, meaning rocks that look like trees. Verrazzano admired them when he sailed up the river in 1524. He called them offensive trees. Later, the Undercliff community was established by fishermen and boat builders. But let us start with some geology. The cliffs are over 200 million years old, and they, oh, I didn't even put my glasses on. And they have originally reached 1,000 feet. They are the margin of a diabase sill made of finely crystalline basalt rock. This was formed by an igneous intrusion of molten magma into sandstone. The molten material cooled and solidified before reaching the surface. Water and erosion of the softer sandstone left behind the columnar structure of the harder rock with the long vertical cracks that exist today. These cracks made them susceptible to rockfalls, especially in the spring, as ice frozen in the crevices thaws and loosens the outermost face. They are shown to perfection in this photo from the National Geographic magazine. It shows the columns very clearly, and if you look in the upper left-hand corner, you might see a small profile of a man. The Palisade Sill was designated by the Department of Interior as the best example of a diabase sill in the entire United States. While the cliffs are the most visible part of the sill, it does run further north. They begin at Jersey City at only 50 feet. After that, they are 150 feet at the George Washington Bridge and reach their highest point of 540 feet at the State Line Lookout. The Undercliff community was located in a narrow strip of land along the Hudson River below Alpine, New Jersey. It was about 11 miles long and 100 yards wide, that once teemed with activity. A bit of it can be seen at the base of in the lower left of the photo. The main industry, as I said, was boat building and fishing, especially for shad and its shad roe. This was a very demanding occupation, but a profitable undertaking. Spring was a busy time for the fishermen in the towns along the river. Poles were planted in the riverbed at an angle to the shore, with strong nets attached. Timing was important. The fish were caught on the incoming tide, and the nets had to be pulled in before the outgoing tide washed the fish out of the nets to return to the sea. New York City was a good market and would take all the fish the men could send. It was a common sight to see hundreds of Hudson River sloops and schooners waiting to pick up the fish. Unfortunately, by the mid-1940s, the shad stopped running. Pollution had driven them from the river. The spawn became sick and died. Suckers and eels gobbled up the eggs. In the 1890s, extensive quarrying of the cliffs in the Tappan Zee area removed much of the trap rock for buildings and cobblestone streets in New York City. In 1908, men like J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, Teddy Roosevelt, governor of New York State at the time, Averell Harriman, and many others banded together to save the Palisades from further quarrying. Another group that helped was the New Jersey Federation of Women's Clubs. A small park on the cliff top near the State Line Lookout has a plaque honoring the ladies' accomplishments. In addition to the quarrying, I learned that after the Civil War, patent medicine companies and others covered the rock face with advertisements 20 feet tall. That's graffiti on a gigantic scale. Indestructible as the Palisades may seem, On May 12, 2012, around 7:30 in the morning, 500 feet of rock came crashing down. The cliffs, unstable from water and ice weakening them, gave way with such force that it shook the ground for more than half a minute and dumped a fresh layer of boulders, some as large as a school bus. I'm not supposed to turn around, but I hope it's up there for you to see. It also left the pyramid-sized pile of trees and debris, some of which were pushed into the river, as you can see in these photos. Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory in Palisades, New York, estimated that 10,000 tons of rock fell. The crash was heard and felt in nearby towns and registered as a slight earthquake on the seismograph at Lamont Doherty. Another picture. George Washington was found to have slept in many places in the Northeast. Some of these towns were in the Palisade area. One of his visits was after the battles of Brooklyn and Manhattan, which, if you remember, did not go very well. He made his way up to what is now Washington Heights. From there, he and his army made their way across the Hudson River. This contemporary sketch of the cliffs at Undercliff shows boats filled with men, equipment, and cannons crossing the river. You can also see their landing spot, the diagonal road to the top of the cliffs, and a scar from a past rockfall. I originally thought the sketch showed Washington arriving at Undercliff, but later learned that it was Cornwallis. It was his army in those boats. Washington had landed earlier and thus gained a head start on Cornwallis. Once in Fort Lee, he did not waste any time moving his troops west before Cornwallis arrived, and so saved his army for future battles. The old 76-house tavern in Taffet, New York, lies at the slope of the Palisades and is often referred to as Andre's prison. He was Adjutant General to Sir Henry Clinton, Commander-in-Chief of the British forces in North America. Benedict Arnold was a brilliant and respected general, but he had become embittered by charges brought by Congress that caused him to betray his country. He asked Washington for command of strategic West Point and planned to hand over to Andre details of its fortifications. Andre hid the plans on his person. Unfortunately, the boats he expected to return him to New York City were retreated after being fired upon by the Americans. He had to return to the city by land, was stopped by suspicious militiamen, taken into custody, the plans found, and Andre imprisoned in the 76 house. Arnold was informed that some spy had been captured and lost no time getting to Manhattan. Washington wrote to Clinton, offering to exchange Andre for Arnold. Clinton was tempted, but in the end refused, leaving Andre to his fate. Andre was popular with his peers on both sides, and after a reluctant military tribunal of 14 generals, he was hanged and buried nearby. General von Steuben declared, quote, "It is impossible to save him. Would that the wretch who had drawn him to his death might be made to suffer in his stead," unquote. In 1821, Andre's remains were exhumed and brought to Westminster Abbey in London. My Andre story began when I visited Japan on a 5th grade field trip. It ended when my daughter and I were in London strolling around Westminster Abbey. I came to a plaque in the wall and was amazed to see that it was to John Andre. That unexpected find brought my Andre story full circle. Weehawken, remember that Indian phrase? Today it is a town located below the George Washington Bridge. But on July 11, 1804, in Weehawken, on a narrow ledge on the side of the Palisades, it was the location of a national event, the Alexander Hamilton-Arenberg duel. This resulted in Hamilton's death and had lasting consequences for Burr, Vice President of the United States at the time. The background of the two could not have been more different. Hamilton was a child of the West Indies. A kind neighbor helped with his education and sent him to the United States. Burr, however, came from a distinguished family. His maternal grandfather was Jonathan Edwards, the well-known theologian. He and Aaron Burr Sr. were each president of Princeton University. Hamilton and Burr were well educated and rose quickly in courts and politics, but they were competitive from the start. This eventually drove them apart. By the time of the duel, their political fortunes had faded. Each was anxious to regain his importance and influence, but Hamilton was careless of his comments and insulted Burr in public once too often. Burr felt his honor was in question and challenged Hamilton to a duel. Upon the command to fire, both pistols went off at the same time. Burr's shot hit Hamilton in the stomach, while Hamilton's went wild. He died the next day. Aaron Burr was vilified as a cold-blooded killer, and for the first time in our history, a vice president of the United States was indicted for murder. His good reputation lost forever. After a while, he headed west to establish his own country in Texas. That, on its own, is a very interesting story. Burr is buried in a corner of the Princeton Cemetery, next to his father and his grandfather. The Palisades State Park Commission was founded in 1908 to ensure the survival of the Palisades from top to bottom. Land along the cliffs running north from Fort Lee to the Tappan Zee was acquired. This included Millionaire's Row, the property and mansions of the wealthy that lined the cliff top. After the Civil War, the Hudson River and the Palisades became a popular country resort for wealthy New Yorkers. It offered a reprieve from the heat and dust of the crowded city. One such resort was the Palisade Mountain House that stood at the cliff's very edge. A Hudson River dock was built to allow 2 steamships a day to transport guests from lower Manhattan. However, the resort was short-lived. In 1884, it was destroyed by fire and never rebuilt. After the destruction of the Mountain House, the Sisters of St. Joseph of Peace purchased land as a summer retreat for young women, and later an orphanage for boys. St. Peter's College is now located on the property. There were difficulties for the commission. Sing Sing Prison planned to move from Masten, New York, across the Hudson to the Bear Mountain area. Before they could, however, New York State purchased a 740-acre Bear Mountain tract, and Sing Sing stayed in Austin. The mansions of Millionaire's Row are gone, but some of the properties became lovely little parks. Greenbrook Sanctuary, a more sizable clifftop park, was created in Alpine. One of the estates was partly in my town, and well known to me, the Riondo's Rio Vista. Mr. Riondo was a sugar magnate from Cuba. In 1910s, he erected this 100-foot clock tower on the cliff top. An elevator went to the top floor observatory room. Rio Vista in my day was a delightful 360-foot, 650-acre woodland estate, complete with 7.5 miles of carriage roads, all in their original design. They were ideal for hiking and riding, and in my case, receiving my engagement ring. The property remained in the Riondo family until the 1960s. At that time, many expensive new homes were to be built on the land. But the tower is now owned by the borough of Alpine, and thankfully protected. New York State later appropriated $2,500,000 and New Jersey $500,000 to build a road on the cliff top, the future Palisade Parkway. In 2013, no, I'm sorry, I skipped. The commission had made a pact with the towns located on the top of the cliffs that nothing that rose above the tree line would be built. This pact lasted for 100 years, until now. In 2013, LG Electronics, a South Korean company, managed to get the zoning in Englewood Cliffs changed from 35 feet, the height of the tree line, to 143 feet, the height of the building they plan to erect. There have been unfavorable articles published in the New York Times, the Bergen Record, and other newspapers, without success. All this in spite of the fact that the Palisades are on an international endangered landmark list. There was a critique in the New York Times that called LG's proposed building an eyesore and a public shame. Rose Harvey, New York State's Park Commissioner, pleaded directly with the company to reconsider. Unfortunately, LG is standing firm. Another view against the LG spoke of the interference with the primary route of many birds that use the west side of the Hudson in large numbers spring and fall. Quote, "The location of the tower in this extremely sensitive location will place these birds, some already endangered, at even greater risk," unquote. The Palisades and the Northern Valley were active places during World War I. Camp Merritt, the largest embarkation camp in the country, was in Cresskill, New Jersey, across the valley from the slopes of the Palisades. It was also my hometown. It was named for Wesley Merritt, a Civil War general. Nearly 1 million young men passed through on their way to France. Camp Merritt was huge. It covered 770 acres and had 1,314 buildings, and a theater seated 2,300. The largest Broadway shows were staged there for the boys. After their indoctrination, the men marched down to the valley. Some boarded trains for Jersey City or Hoboken, and the ships waiting for them. Others had to climb the Palisades and go down the cliffs to boats taking them to their ships. After the war, this 65-foot granite monument was erected in what was the center of the camp, a tribute to those who served in the war. General John J. Pershing, who commanded the United States troops in Europe, gave the dedication speech before more than 20,000 people on Memorial Day, May 30th, 1924. In the years after Camp Merritt was demolished, the roads and sidewalks became a playground for neighborhood children. We even had what we called a cave in one of the hills. There was also a remaining concrete wall. To us, that was where they shot the spies. Before our entrance into World War II, across the lower Palisades, several of the great miners were birthed in New York City to keep them out of the hands of the Germans. Eventually, they were turned into troop ships. The fate of the Normandy was particularly sad. While she was being converted, sparks from a welder's torch ignited life preservers and set the ship ablaze. All the water poured on the ship caused her to list. In 1942, the Navy recommended raising the burned hulk for salvage. The operation was completed in 1947. Until then, the Normandy, lying on her side, was a focal point for everyone going down the West Side Highway. World War II also played a part in the history of the Palisades. Its story closely followed the last wars. Cresskill was too populated for another large embarkation camp, so Camp Shanks was built in Old Tappan, New Jersey, near the tavern where John Andre had been kept prisoner. After the war, the freighters and transports in this photo were mothballed and anchored in the Hudson River below the Bear Mountain Bridge. There seemed to be thousands of them, or maybe at least hundreds. On every drive that way, we looked for the ships, and then one day to our disappointment, they were gone, to be broken up for scrap metals. They had been kept there all those years to be ready in case they were needed again. Electric currents for underwater corrosion. Another interesting use was as bins for storing surplus wheat. Hollywood on the Hudson. In the middle of the Palisades, there was a town known as Fort Lee. But from 1907 to 1924, it was known as the capital of the silent movie industry. In 1907, Fort Lee was just a ferry ride from Manhattan. From then until 1924, it was a busy, bustling movie colony. The early map of Fort Lee scoffed, "Here is the real Hollywood. The other is just a cow pasture." Fort Lee was chosen by movie companies for its scenic wonders, farms, marshes, picturesque homes, and the spectacular Palisades towering over the Hudson River. They could even use the nearby Palisade Amusement Park as a ready-made set. Some studio names in 1907 are familiar today: Universal, Golden, Mayer, and Selznick. They were all within easy commuting distance of Manhattan via the 125th Street ferry. Once the ferry landed, however, there was the problem of getting the workers to the top of the cliffs. This is where trolleys came in. But imagine getting a trolley up those heights. I think going down would be worse. To solve this problem, a road was carved into the side of the cliff. Many stars who worked in the Fort Lee studios have been forgotten, but others are still familiar today. Mary Pickford, Ethel, Lionel, John Barrymore, Douglas Fairbanks, Charlie Chaplin, and the Wizard of Oz himself, Frank Morgan. The cliffs made an exciting backdrop for films, and it was here that Pearl White as Pauline met her perils, and the word cliffhanger was introduced to the English language. Incidentally, Milton Berle appeared in one of the Perils of Pauline films. But it was a wartime fuel shortage in 1918, the coldest winter in memory, the deadly flu epidemic, and competition that caused the producers to leave for the sunshine of California. Hollywood on the Pacific was established. The early Fort Lee had said that the other Hollywood was just a cow pasture. Well, Fort Lee wasn't exactly a cow pasture, but its heyday was over. Hollywood on the Hudson was no more. In Fort Lee, all that was left in 1925 was the memory.